Hello, this is the second part of the reading assignment for Unit 1. In this case study about reconstructing a Germanic language from the 9th century, I want to explain why it is difficult in a tree diagram like this to say that each of these entities is really a separate language, because here we're kind of looking at an evolution in time, and it's very difficult. This is sort of like a chronological aspect of why it is difficult to say that something is a language. So let's look at this 9th century language that is called Old Saxon. Sometimes it's called Old Saxon, sometimes it is called Old Low German, and it's related, and 1,000 years ago was very similar to what was called Old English. So, for instance, the language that is generally known as Old Saxon is attested in only 2 texts that exist in just a few manuscripts. One is a 6,000 verse alliterative gospel epic. So, back in the 9th century, when Europe was Christianized, for the first time there was a necessity to translate the gospel into the vernaculars of Northern Europe. So these were the earliest texts that were actually written in the Germanic languages spoken at the time. So we may ask whether the particular linguistic features of these texts are in fact idiosyncratic to the person who wrote them, and whether these linguistic features are truly representative of the vernacular that was spoken in the geographical area where the text is assumed to have originated, namely a monastery close to the city of Düsseldorf in Germany. What is more, as may have been the case for most scribes of that era, imagine writing was practiced by very few people, trained in a handful of scriptoria and monasteries throughout the Germanic world of the 9th century. It was unlikely that it was a woman, may have been a multilingual. To hypothesize the existence of a language as a definable historical entity is really a far stretch. But to attribute these linguistic fragments to a people that we call the Old Saxon people, culturally and geographically at a specific time in a specific place, is almost impossible. So there are so few texts like that to say this represents a language spoken in this geographical area at this time is extremely controversial. So as one historical linguist pointed out, and I'm quoting Keller, we do not know whether the 3rd century Saxons, the 7th and 8th century Saxons of England, and the 8th century Saxons of North Germany conquered by Charlemagne were the same people or not. We do not know with what tribe or background we have to reckon for Old Saxon, recorded in the 9th century. Tribal names are easily detached from one people and attached to another, and the same is true for languages. So even for the languages that have been studied for centuries, such as the Germanic languages, it is difficult, if not impossible, to associate the linguistic fossils, like this manuscript that you see from the 9th century, with a particular people with absolute certainty. And we'll see later that this difficulty to define a language as a historical entity persists even today. After considering the evolution of linguistic complexity, The question, why are there so many different languages, does not sound so difficult anymore. One could simply answer by saying, because it could not be otherwise. People, as we know, constantly influenced by their environment and contact with others. They move around and their lives change. Just like teenagers today constantly invent new slang, their own informal vocabulary, in our culture they have always done so in all places and at all times throughout history. What all languages have in common are so-called linguistic universals. For instance, all languages have nouns and verbs. All languages depend on the systematic combination of discrete units in infinite new ways. According to the American linguist Noam Chomsky, however, the differences between the extant languages across the globe may be more superficial than it seems. According to Chomsky, the creative stringing together of language units into new combinations underlies some abstract principles that hold the systems together and make it possible for human infants to learn languages so effortlessly in the first place. Chomsky believes that the principles that allow us to create infinite new utterances with a finite set of linguistic units are not specific to language. In other words, the abstract principles humans exploit for language are exploited in other cognitive domains. One related hypothesis is that the cognitive principles that enable humans to use language also enables us to create and appreciate music, architecture, and other systems where finite sets of units are combined in infinite new creations. Chomsky also believes that language is primarily a tool of thought rather than a communication system. This may sound strange at first, but think about how our pre-linguistic ancestors knew whether to trust or be scared of someone. Think about what enhanced their chances of survival other than their ability to trust, love someone, know a friend, understand the needs of their young without language as we know it. Just like any other animal, they must have relied on other communication systems that are still present in nonverbal codes. But our emphasis on language has created the illusion that nonverbal communication is less powerful than it may be. In our next section, I will discuss again this question, what is a language? Why is it difficult to define? And I'm going to talk about the concepts of language and dialect.